Do me the honors, brother.
Today, we're joined by a truly distinguished guest, Professor Corinna Lain, the S.D. Roberts and Sandra Moore Professor of Law at the University of Richmond School of Law. She's a nationally recognized expert on the death penalty and Supreme Court decision-making, with work published in top law journals like Stanford, Penn, and Duke. A former prosecutor and Army veteran, Professor Lain brings a powerful combination of real-world experience and deep academic insight to her work. Her upcoming book, Secrets of the Killing State, offers a groundbreaking look into the untold history of lethal injection in America. Professor Lain, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's a great vibe. I've been listening to your music. I love it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, you got three generations, yes. Professor Lain. You got myself. I'm the elder statesman. We got Dab Dub, aka Douglas, and then we got Simply Courtney, who is he's the young buck, but there's an outstanding young man, and we're like Batman, Robin, and Robin Jr. We just killing it.
We're trying to mold him. We're going to help him grow up.
I'm moldable because I'm clay.
You are clay, sir. That's for sure.
Professor Lain, what initially drew you to focus your scholarship on the death penalty and Supreme Court decision making?
Well, I'm a legal historian, and I was taught in high school civics class that the Supreme Court played this role of protector of unpopular minorities against tyrannical majorities. And so when I joined academia, when I became part of law faculty, I thought, well, let's just see if that's true. I love history, so let's dive into it. And so that's what got me into legal history pieces on Supreme Court decision making. And then I happened upon a piece. I kept looking for okay, what's the unpopular minority? And really wasn't finding the Supreme Court playing that role. And so finally I was like, well, what's the most unpopular minority I can think of? And it was capital defendants. It was death row inmates. And so I did a legal history piece on that. The Supreme Court decided a case, Furman versus Georgia in 1972, that struck down the death penalty. And a lot of people don't know that, but there were 4 years when we didn't have a death penalty. And then it brought it back in 76. So that's what, and then you start writing on the death penalty, you can't look away.
How has your experience as a prosecutor and your time in the military influenced the way you approach legal scholarship and teaching?
Well, so as far as teaching, I really try to bring in a practical perspective for the students. Yes, they're going to learn high theory, but I want to tell them about, look, this is what it looks like. This is what the job looks like. This is these are the issues that you're going to have. It also works its way into my studying of the death penalty. And I just have to say that as a former prosecutor, I yield to no one in my empathy for victims of violent crime, for the family members of people who have been killed. And so, one of the things that I been thinking about a lot lately, especially, is whether the death penalty is even really, I don't purport to speak for any victim, but I'll just say it takes 15 to 20 years. And so I've been studying these executions, and what I'm seeing is these people, they lost their family members, and then also they've lost 2 decades of their life, waiting, and instead of just, starting the healing process and moving on. And so, it creeps into various ways.
You've spent over a decade researching lethal injection. What do most people misunderstand about how it actually works in practice?
Everything.
Well, there you go.
So,
that's it.
That's it. I started writing it down, and it insisted upon being a book. Let's just say that. That's the book.
Yeah.
But, I thought that lethal injection was like putting down, a beloved pet, only it's, for humans. And it's nothing like that. We're not torturing our pets, by the way. That was a question that came up in my research. So your pets are fine. But, it's nothing like that. For the first 35 years of lethal injection, they didn't use the same drugs. They used a 3-drug protocol. Putting down a pet uses a 1-drug pentobarbital protocol. And for the first 35 years of lethal injection, that 3-drug protocol was nothing like what they do for pets. Wasn't even the same drug. Oh. And nowadays, some states, including Texas, use the 1-drug protocol, but it's compounded because they can't buy the manufactured version. And and compounding sterile injectables, it's a whole other story. So that's, it's still not the same. I thought doctors were doing this. I really did.
Yeah.
And turns out the people pushing the plungers, the people pushing the syringes that are actually doing it, they're non-medical prison guards, that are from another room. And I'm like, what? Ugh. No, that can't be right. And of course, we don't know in any given execution, but because of secrecy, but everything we know tells us, including some documents from Texas, that the people pushing the syringes are non-medical prison guards. And then just the physiology is different. So pets, think of it, they go down in 60 seconds or so.
Yeah.
Lethal injection takes about 18 minutes.
What?
Yes, I know. And as one doctor told me, suffering takes time. Suffering takes time. And you've certainly got it, which is why we see, prisoners saying, I'll take the firing squad, or, I'll take the electric chair. And what they've said is, yeah, we know it's going to be a torturous death, but, our best move is to make it quick.
If you're joining us late, we have Professor Corinna Lain, professor of law, University of Richmond School of Law. And we're talking about her upcoming book, Secrets of the Killing State, which offers a groundbreaking look into the untold history of lethal injection in America. So, Professor Lain, in your view, how has the death penalty system evolved in the U.S. over the past 20 years? I mean, you were saying for 35 years, we just brought death penalty back in 76 after the 4-year hiatus. How did it evolve in the U.S. over the past 20?
Well, 1976 marks what we call the modern era of the death penalty. And, it's had its highs and lows. One thing I think is pretty remarkable is that over the past 20 years, 2 decades, death sentencing across the country has fallen just over 80%. Oh. So, yeah. So, in 2004, we had around 125 new death sentences. In 2024, the last year for which we have complete data, that number was 26. Yeah. So 125 to 26 across the whole country. Yeah. And Texas has seen those numbers go down too. In fact, part of this, so of course the El Paso shooter, the Walmart shootings, yeah. He just pled, or he's going to plead to life. And, there were multiple, I think it was maybe 24 deaths in that. And really, quite aggravated. One of the reasons that pled out was because the victims said, you know what, we don't want to be, dragged through this entire process. He can go away for, they are taking his life. He'll never get out, right? Yeah. You are taking their life. You're just, you're just really allowing the family to be done with it.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Even if they appeal, which he won't because it's a plea, but even if they appeal, they're serving their sentence. Whereas if it's the death penalty, you're waiting for the punishment. You can't move on. You're still waiting. And so you see that bleeding into the cases around the country.
What surprised you the most while writing Secrets of the Killing State? Were there any revelations that changed the way you think about the justice system?
Yes. But, as far as what surprised me the most, I thought that there was some kind of science behind lethal injection?
Yeah.
I mean, surely some guy didn't just make it up off the top of his head. But no, some guy
Not the case.
made it up off the top of his head. That literally happened. So this was 1977. It was Oklahoma. And Oklahoma was looking for a new way to execute. The country hadn't seen an execution in 10 years. And politicians were afraid that, the country was not going to be able to stomach the violence of the electric chair. So they were looking for a new way. They thought of drugs, and they asked around. Nobody would help them. But the state medical examiner, a guy named Jay Chapman, was game. And he later referred to himself as an expert in dead bodies, but not in how to get them that way.
Oh.
And in a later interview, he said, I didn't do any research. I just thought about what was needed from being under anesthesia myself. And, and so it was like, wait, what? Nobody even studied it? There weren't, like, you didn't get into the medical literature or pharmacology or anything? Nope, nothing. And then all the other states, including Texas, followed him. And, about that, he later said, I never would have guessed in my wildest flight of fancy that they would just blindly follow it, but they did.
Oof.
So that was a surprise. There's long-standing problems with the death penalty that really make me wonder about the criminal justice process. So there's a study, let's just, call it, one is racism in the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
And, people think of the perhaps more obvious, okay, it depends on the race of the defendant. What most people don't know is that the really big, the really big factor is the race of the victim. So it goes from whose lives are we going to take to whose lives are we going to protect? And there was a study, a very famous study called the Baldus study. And they found that when you have a black defendant and a white victim, the chances of getting the death penalty are 4.1 times more, 4 times more, after considering over 230 variables and taking out, I don't know what it was, 39 or something like that, non-racial variables. So there's nothing left but race, nothing left. And it's there's nothing left but race, and you're 4 times more likely to get the death penalty. And I don't know, I just think good people on both sides of the aisle should be offended by that, right? That's, nobody can defend that. That's indefensible.
No.
So, there's all kinds of things that, and I'll tell you, I wrote the legal history on Furman, and then the first moment that I was like, wait, what? And really started studying the death penalty was a case out of Texas.
Oh.
And it was a death case. It was a capital case where the lawyer fell asleep.
No.
That literally happened.
No.
And there was no denying it. He wasn't like, no, I was thinking in my head, or no, I was resting my eyes. No, I fell asleep. And the court literally said, the Constitution says you're entitled to a lawyer. It doesn't say they have to be awake.
Oh, man. You know what?
And that was a while ago, but, this is the sort of thing. I think that when people say they support the death penalty, it's like, I had an idea, I certainly did as a prosecutor, that it's, done a certain, embedded in that support would be okay, but you're not going to have sleeping lawyers. Okay, but you're not going to have prosecutors hiding exculpatory evidence. Okay, but, all of those okay buts.
Yeah.
And the closer you look, the more it's just quite simply not true.
I have a couple more questions on the Supreme Court and broader legal topics. You've studied how the Supreme Court makes decisions. What patterns or trends have you noticed that might surprise the general public?
Well, historically, the Supreme Court has had a really interesting relationship with the public. And that's been the focus of my research on Supreme Court decision making, where it's well, why is it that the court is largely majoritarian? That is, it tends to track majority views. Now, there's an exception to that, and I think we're in the exception right now. And it is when you have justices with particularly strong ideological bents. What we see is they actually don't care if they're moving, with public sentiment. So the death penalty is a really nice example of that. Justice Marshall, Justice Brennan, even in Law and Order times, they were like, I don't care. I'm against the death penalty. I think it's unconstitutional. I'm going to vote to reverse in every case. On the flip side of that, Justice Scalia, Justice Rehnquist in their day, even when we had the actual innocence revolution in 2000, where, all of these cases of actual innocence were found on death row, they were like, yeah, that's just a cost of doing business. I don't care. That's not going to change my view at all. So, on the extremes, they don't track. But until now, really, we've always had median justices and a roughly balanced court. And so I think one of the interesting things that people don't realize is that generally the court, tracks public opinion, but I don't know that my research is I think it's proving to be the exception that proves the rule. I'll just say that.
Last question, Professor Lain. Again, for those who may have joined us a little late, we have Professor Corinna Lain, the S.D. Roberts and Sandra Moore Professor of Law at the University of Richmond School of Law, and her upcoming book, Secrets of the Killing State, which offers a groundbreaking look into the untold history of lethal injection in America. This isn't the last question. This is the question before the question. When does that book come out? Because I was going to say spring 2025, but we're close, right?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. It comes out next Tuesday, April 22nd. Okay. And here's a cool thing. There's a faith story behind this. You can find it, frankly, on my website, CorinnaLain.com. Behind the book is the tab. But so there's a whole testimony behind writing this book that people can find on their own. But NYU Press, which is not a religious press, right? But they chose Easter 2025 as the release date. They chose that 18 months ago, which was at least half a year before the Pope declared 2025 the year of the Jubilee, and a full year before the Pope declared ending the death penalty to be the theme of the 2025 Jubilee.
Wow.
Yeah.
Check that out.
I know. God's timing is perfect.
So this will be the last one. How do you think the court's recent rulings reflect larger shifts in American political or cultural life?
I mean, is it okay to say they don't?
Oh, yeah.
You certainly see a wing. So, I mean, we could talk about abortion, their abortion ruling, or some of the other rulings. But, there are certainly slices of the population that were really happy with that. But at the time they made that decision, Dobbs, rolling back Roe versus Wade and, rolling back those constitutional protections that I had, but that my daughters won't have. Yeah. But, before there's certainly a wing that is really supportive of that. But at the time, I think it was 63, maybe 65% of the public supported choice, at least in the first trimester. So, that's not really, it's consistent with a segment of the population, but it was not actually consistent with overall population, and it became an issue, a swing issue in those midterms. But that's the relationship that the court has with the people. Mm-hmm.
Professor Corinna Lain, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insight today. It's been an eye-opening conversation. Listeners, be sure to keep an eye out for her upcoming book, Secrets of the Killing State, dropping April 22nd, 2025. It's a powerful and important read that digs deep into the hidden truths behind lethal injection in America. We're honored to have had you on the show. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It has just been such a pleasure talking with you. Take care, Douglas.
Thanks.
Very good. Thank you, Professor Lain. Hang out with us for just a little bit, okay? All right, this is the Morning Grind on 88.7 FM KAZI. We'll be back, y'all.
More to come with the Morning Grind right here on 88.7 FM KAZI.